Hi everyone, we're recording now, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome, thanks for taking the time and an hour out of your day to come and listen to me witter on about Shōchū. In January this year, 10 WSET educators from the UK, US and Canada visited Kyūshū and Ryūkyū, and I was privileged to be part of that party. When we were there, we took a deep dive into the production and the culture of one of Japan's traditional spirits, Honkaku Shōchū and Awamori. And I suppose this webinar is just a product of that trip and an opportunity for me to kind of share some of the experience and some of the amazing insight that we received when we were there. We got pretty much unfettered access to lots of distilleries that we couldn't really dream of, and I think it was an experience that we all cherish, those of us who went, and hopefully I can share some of that experience, as I say, and hopefully it doesn't come across as too self-indulgent or a kind of episode of Wish You Were Here, but it's something that I know the other educators on the trip are really passionate about spreading the word of and the love for, but I still can very much consider myself a student of these spirits. I'm not an absolute expert in these disciplines that we're going to cover. In fact, when I visited, I was pretty much a complete novice. All I'd experienced of Honkaku Shōchū and Awamori through the level 3 spirits that I previously studied. And actually some of the more widely available Shōchū, the more neutral styles of Shōchū that are produced throughout the country through a bar that I used to manage. But the traditional spirits of Honkaku Shōchū and Awamori were relatively new to me. But I've got enough information at hand now and enough resource to be able to, as I say, kind of put this presentation together and share some of the wealth. So before I get deep into all the content though, it's only right that I have a list of thanks to say, because there's plenty of people that the trip wouldn't have happened without. Firstly, my WSET colleagues Anthony Moss and Natsuki Kikuya couldn't have happened without you. Toshi, who hopefully is watching, I will wave to Toshi and give her a big virtual hug. Love to Toshi. Obviously the National Tax Agency of Japan, all the prefectures that hosted us, the brewing and distilling associations that hosted us, and the various dinners and formal gatherings that we all enjoyed, and all of our handlers, hosts and interpreters, or mums and dads as we called them on the trip. The whole trip was made amazing by all of your hard work, and we couldn't have survived without you. I think it's fair to say, keeping us fed and watered and constantly on the move and constantly learning, so thanks for that. A special thanks needs to go to Mr. Nick Corn for many of the photos within this presentation. He took an amazing camera and took some amazing shots, and has been generous enough to share some of those for this presentation, so thanks Nick. In regards to questions, I'm going to try and keep my eye on the chat and answer questions as they come along. However, if I miss anything, then Lydia's going to kind of scoop them up, and then we'll try and have a bit of a Q&A session at the end. As I said, I'm not an absolute expert in a lot of these disciplines, so if I can answer your question, I will do it honestly. If I don't know the answer, then I'll tell you honestly. And the final thing I'll say is apologies for some of my pronunciation, because I'm sure I'm going to get some things wrong. Okay, if we're ready, we'll move on then. So just to kind of give a bit of context and orientate ourselves firstly, just wanted to cover off what part of Japan we actually visited. And what you can see there in the map on the left-hand side is the country of Japan, and the two areas that our trip focused on: the main island of Kyūshū, and then the long island chain of Ryūkyū, which is where Okinawa Prefecture is and produces Aomori. Kagoshima Prefecture also includes Umami, which we will finish our virtual tour with, which makes Honkaku Shōchū, but also Kagoshima Prefecture has the GIs of Satsuma Shōchū, made exclusively in Kagoshima, and we'll also visit the prefectures of Miyazaki and Kumamoto. One thing to highlight there through probably the map on the right hand side, but is you can see the difference in longitude between the most northerly point that we visited, Kumamoto, and the most southerly point in Okinawa. A huge difference in climate between those places, almost 10 degree difference in longitude. So obviously that has a significant effect on the climate and the terrain in those places, and also on the production method and style of shochu that is produced. So just to add a little bit more context, and I've lifted these slides from the level 3 spirits materials. So thanks to Nick King for letting me do that. One of the core differences between European and Asian traditions in terms of spirits production is the processing of starchy material into a fermentable sugar and the fermentation of this sugar into an alcohol. In Europe, this process is sequential, and we can see from the flow diagram on the top, taking that starchy substrate, which is typically a grain, and using a combination of malting, if we're using barley, and cooking, plus the addition of exogenous enzymes and mashing to then convert those soluble starches into a fermentable sugar, and mixing obviously with water to give us a sugary liquid. That is then that first stage done. We have our sugary liquid. What we can then do is add yeast to that sugary liquid, and either selected and cultured yeast strain or sometimes wild yeast strains are used to proceed with alcoholic fermentation to give us an alcohol. Those steps are sequential. We are producing a sugary liquid, and then we are adding yeast in order to encourage alcoholic fermentation to give us an alcohol. In Asian tradition, by contrast, the process of starch conversion to sugar and sugar to alcohol is happening concurrently, so happening at the same time. We're going to take a starchy substrate, typically grain like rice or barley, but also sweet potato, which is steamed to gelatinize the starch. Gelatinize basically means making that starch soluble. And then that starchy substrate, that starchy raw material, is inoculated with cultivated fungal enzymes, which are going to convert the starch to sugar, and also yeast is added with water to convert the sugar to alcohol in parallel. These two things are happening concurrently. So as opposed to having a sequential fermentation, which is in a completely liquid state, in this case we've got a parallel fermentation with enzymes from fungus converting starch to sugar, and microorganisms of yeast converting sugars to alcohol at the same time. Obviously, the coexistence of these two different microorganism sets and their various outputs is going to have a huge impact on flavor and style. This also means that the solids present during fermentation in Asian traditions, and in the case of shochu, this is a semi-solid state fermentation. If those of you listened to Derek Sandhouse's presentation on Baiju earlier in the week, would have seen an example of solid state distillation, fermentation rather. Obviously, the solids that are present here are obviously going to impact in style and flavor as well, and are going to have implications for the rest of the production process that we'll come to as we move through the slides. But during this parallel fermentation, as I said, we're having modification and availability of those enzymes and alcoholic fermentation happening at the same time concurrently, giving us an alcoholic semi-solid in this case. Moving on. Just looking a little bit more closely at what these fungal microorganisms are actually doing closely. An analogy that we use here is comparing it to a human digestive system. Obviously, we have a digestive system on the inside. We consume food, and that food is processed inside of our body. Filamentous fungi like this grow into their food and consume food from the inside out. So as we saw on the previous slide, that starchy material, that rice or barley or sweet potato, is steamed, and that steaming is going to unravel those tightly bound starch molecules and make them soluble and gelatinize them. And then those fungal spores are sprinkled into the starch. And if the conditions are warm and moist enough, those filaments will start to grow onto and into the material, which is actually going to release amylases and other enzymes, which is going to grow through the starchy material, and then those nutrients are going to be consumed by the fungi. Sugar is one of the nutrients that's created, and when this material is now kind of rich in enzymes, it can be mixed with another raw material to kind of, add a definitive type of flavor. And we'll look at a two-step mashing process when we move on to Honkaku Shōchū in Kyūshū. What's important to mention at this point, though, is the impact of this fungus on the final style of the spirit. The type of fungus that is being used has the potential to impact dramatically on the style and the flavors that we find in the glass of the shochu at the end of production. So let's look in detail of how we're processing these grains, or how we're processing the raw substrate, the raw starch, in order to create koji. And koji is the name of that mold that grows on that substrate, and it will either be rice koji, barley koji, or sweet potato koji, depending on what the raw material was initially. In this case, we've used rice as the example, and rice, is fair to say, is the most common material used to create koji, but we'll look at some other examples as we move through the slides. But rice is the one that you'll be familiar with, obviously, in terms of sake production. But it's the use of an impact of koji mold that sets spirits in this presentation apart from other spirits. Without this koji, spirits produced from barley in Japan would be similar to malt whiskey, and spirits produced from brown sugar would be similar to rum. In Japan, typically, as I say, koji is made from rice, but we've seen it made from barley and sweet potato as well, and we'll look at some of those examples. In the case of grains like rice and barley, the grains need to be polished primarily to remove sulfur compounds, and that's going to have implications later on in the process. If the sulfur compounds aren't managed effectively here, then they'd be concentrated to unmanageable levels during distillation. So the grains, when they're polished in terms of shochu, are typically not polished to anywhere near the kind of level you'd be expecting in sake production. They're polished to much, much lower levels. Once they've been polished to remove some of those sulfur compounds, then the substrate is washed, soaked and steamed to gelatinize the starch and make it soluble, as we've said. Once it's soluble, this softened starchy material is then inoculated with cultured and selected fungal spores of a particular variety, which we can see some on the bottom of the screen there. And they're either yellow, white, or black, those varieties regarded as. They're produced in temperature-controlled rooms, and as I said, the mold grows into and onto the starch, releasing the necessary enzymes to produce sugars, providing the distiller with a batch of koji of a particular variety. The yellow variety on the left-hand side of the screen there, you'll be familiar to many of you, Aspergillus oryzae, is the koji mold used to produce sake. It's not typically used in Honkaku Shōchū production because it's very sensitive to heat, making it untenable in some of the warmer climates of this region. As I've said, Okinawa and Umami islands specifically are subtropical, but Kyūshū gets really warm as well. Therefore, the use of yellow koji like this is rare. Black koji and white koji are both versions of Aspergillus lucensis. White koji is a mutation of Aspergillus lucensis, the black version. And they are prevalent in shochu and Awamori production. Both are more resistant to temperature. The white koji is regarded as the most efficient and easy to grow. and manage. Black is renowned for its higher levels of citric acid that are produced. Both white and black produce great levels of citric acid, which has a really, really positive impact on the fermentation in these areas, enabling it to be more resistant to temperature, enabling it to not spoil effectively. Black koji is the one to highlight here, though, and it's the one we're going to look at firstly when we talk about Aomori, because it's produced to layer on this really rich, roasted, often bold, smoky, mushroomy, and nutty flavors that, frankly, are really, really distinctive and unlike anything I or any of the educators on the trip had ever tasted before. White, it was said, was used more to preserve the aromas of the raw material, and black was used for that really big flavor impact. So we'll get into the distilleries that we visited, and we're going to do them in chronological order as we came across them on the trip in January. I'm going to use a slide or two to feature each distillery visited, and try and use each distillery to focus on a particular category, concept, or production feature that kind of really sets them apart. So we start in the most southerly and westerly part of our trip on the main island of Okinawa. Okinawa is probably familiar to some of you. It was certainly familiar to me before the trip as a former US military base. And there's still a great deal of kind of US influence on the island. It's subtropical there, and lots of it reminded of us in many parts of kind of parts of America that has a similar climate, because there is that much of an American influence there. But thankfully, the local kind of traditional spirit of Aomori retained the heritage and is protected by a GI. The spirit said to date back to the Ayutthaya kingdom of the 15th century, and the Okinawa subtropical region is where this particular variety has kind of rose to prominence. It is a GI for Okinawa, made exclusively from long grain rice that's typically from Thailand. It is in the case of this first distillery, exclusively from Thailand, but also this long grain rice is grown in Taiwan and Japan. As I said, Ishikawa, where we are now, uses exclusively Thai rice, and this Thai rice is used exclusively to make 100% Okinawan black koji. The reason for that is because the temperatures are obviously quite high in Okinawa. That high acid output of this black koji is required to maintain fermentation in these particular climates. The other key definitive feature of Aomori is this single fermentation step. So 100% of that substrate, the rice, is koji, and that's obviously going to amplify the impact. When we move through the slides, we're going to see other types of shochu that do a two-step fermentation that introduces a secondary and definitive raw material or starch source, and therefore that impact of the koji is not nullified but dulled down somewhat, because the koji doesn't make up 100% of the fermentation. So as I said, this distillery Ishikawa used Thai rice, which is polished and washed in the drums that we see, and steamed, inoculated, and grown into the black koji, mashed with yeast and water in clay fermenters, like we can see in the picture on the right-hand side. We're going to see clay in use a great deal throughout this particular tour. It has a huge impact at various stages of production. They are temperature controlled, and they were quite open about that temperature control within Ishikawa here. The fermentation initially starts at around 36 degrees Celsius, and that temperature is to promote the enzyme production of the black koji. It's then lowered to about 33 degrees Celsius, and that promotes citric acid production, which is obviously integral to maintaining this quite long fermentation and providing a suitable environment for the yeast. And then it's reduced to around 27 degrees Celsius, which is an ideal temperature for alcoholic fermentation by the yeast. As you can see, the fermentation takes around 3 weeks, which is a long time in comparison to most European traditions. And that 3-week fermentation is obviously going to enable a whole load of flavor creation by the yeast and a whole load of interaction between the outputs of the koji and the outputs of the yeast, as well as the raw material. It's churned, however, that fermentation, and that vessel is churned on a daily basis to incorporate oxygen and to stop the development of any unwanted microbial activity. You can see probably just about from the pictures on the right hand side, the fermenters are covered over most of the time, but they're obviously open to the elements somewhat. They're not completely and utterly cut off from the environment. So we need to expect some microbial activity happening there, and some bacteria which is going to influence the style and flavors that are created, but that does need to be managed, and it does need to be kept on top of, and that's why this churning happens on a daily basis. This fermentation for 3 weeks here would result in a wash of around 17% ABV, which is an indicator of another unique thing, I suppose, about shochu and Asian spirits, that these high wash strengths, these high fermentation strengths, which will have again implications further on in the production process. It's fairly typical to have around 17% here, but some of these fermentations can go up as high as 20% ABV. I'm not going to talk specifically about distillation and the other parts of the process here, but know that Ishikawa also use single distillation, which is the practice within shochu production. But they use atmospheric distillation as well as vacuum distillation, and then maturation in clay as well as stainless steel to produce aged awamori. Okay, let's move on to Mizuho. Again, apologies for my pronunciation. A very memorable part of the trip, the second distillery that we visited, and I want to focus on some different production features, namely yeast. Obviously, yeast is absolutely integral to the process. It's how we're going to create alcohol, but it's also a key driver of flavor here, like it is in many spirits categories. And we got a real insight into the yeast strains at this distillery, and they use 3 main types that you can see in the picture on the left hand side, and they attribute different styles and different flavor characteristics to the different strains of yeast. Ginjo, which some of you will be familiar with that word through sake, used in the production of Ginjo style sakes, and famed for its flavors of kind of fresh fruit and fresh flowers. The Sakura yeast in the middle there. Sakura is the Japanese cherry blossom. It was quite interesting for me to learn about the fame and notoriety of that cherry blossom. I didn't realize there was a cherry blossom tour and season as it moves across the country and people follow it. We saw it at many junctures during our trip, but this distillery had isolated a yeast from the Sakura blossom, which they attributed lots of tropical fruit flavors from, banana and mango. And finally, and probably most importantly, is the Aomori 101 yeast, which is renowned for its body and production of vanillin. And vanillin's a compound that we, in the West at least, most closely associate with oak. But it's been found that this Aomori yeast is not only high strength, high yielding, has a great output of ethanol, but it also produces a great deal of vanillin or precursors to vanilla flavors, which can kind of develop into maple syrup and other associated flavor categories as well. The distillery makes black koji from Taiwanese or Okinawan rice, and they also use three different strains of black koji. But the key thing here is that they must use black koji to make awamori. But the one other major production feature I wanted to focus on here at Mizuho was distillation. well, at least an introduction to the type of distillation that is common within this region, within Awamori, but also within Honkaku Shōchū more generally. Shochus like this are single pot distilled in a pot still similar to the one that you see there. That example is a vacuum still. It's easy to identify given the fact that it's made from stainless steel, but also it's got this ribbed and reinforced exterior, which actually, stainless steel is strong enough to support the difference in pressure between inside and out, and that ribbed exterior supports that. Copper would simply fold in on itself if we were trying to pull a vacuum through it. That lower pressure inside actually reduces the boiling points of all the various compounds within the wash as well. So that means the still can run at a much cooler temperature, reducing the chance of cooking and scorching of some of those solids. Remember we were talking about fermentation a few slides ago, and the fact that we have this parallel fermentation ongoing at the same time with this starchy substrate, this semi-solid fermentation, that is then carried through and placed into the still as well. So the still needs to be carefully heated through a variety of different variables in order to try and manage effectively what is cooking of those solids and those the scorching potentially and flavors created through cooking of those solids. Those flavors are referred to as kind of Maillard reactions, a combination of amino acids and reducing sugars to give foods that we eat, but also plenty of spirits that we're familiar with, these kind of cooked, roasted, toasted flavors. And they can be used to great effect within shochu and other spirits, but they also need to be managed effectively. And these vacuum distillations actually reduce the propensity for those Maillard reactions, producing typically, in the case of vacuum distillation within Aomori, lighter and purer spirits, not as kind of bold and robust. They're often quite floral, quite elegant and quite delicate. And we'll talk about some examples and some comparisons as we move through the slides. As an addition here, I wanted to briefly mention the fact that Shō is this emerging category of triple distilled Awamori, distilled in these stills to around 70% ABV and then bottled at 40%. So these particular varieties have a completely different texture and style, but are obviously still very flavoursome, distilled to a relatively characterful strength in 70%. Obviously, not as well. I probably haven't mentioned this in detail yet, but many shochus are distilled to a much lower strength, made possible by the fact that we have, the single distillation is made possible by the fact that we have this really high fermentation strength, but then the collection strength of the spirit is often 50-45% only. Through a single distillation. So it's fairly unusual, and as I say, a new emerging category to triple distill certain shochus into a kind of 70% spirit, which is still relatively characterful, but obviously contains probably less richness, less fullness of flavour, and certainly different textures compared to traditional Awamori. This particular one is actually from Ishikawa, which is the previous distillery we looked at, but they're all bottled under the same label as kind of a distillery collection of labelled Shō, which I believe was a former king. King's name was Shō, as it says on the bottle. The other thing I wanted to mention on that slide was actually the first thing that we all tasted when we arrived at this distillery and Ishikawa previously was vinegar. And I've never personally drank vinegar straight in that way with ice, but we all were blown away by the kind of purity and complexity of the vinegars that were created from the sake lees left over in these stills. That was something that was really unique for me. Really delicious vinegar from the sake lees. Okay, moving on. The final distillery that we visited in Okinawa was Chuko, and they are also naturally producing Aomori in the same ways in which we've discussed, using long grain Thai rice and exclusively Okinawan black koji, with the yeast 101, which is attributed to the area. Also a mango yeast they're using there, and produced in a single fermentation. Now, although we didn't get to see and much of the processing in terms of fermentation and distillation at this distillery, what we really did focus on was post distillation and their focus on maturation in these earthenware vessels known as kame. As I understand it, kame just is earthenware and clay vessels. So kame would be referring to any earthenware clay vessels used at any stage of spirits production. But here we're going to look at post distillation and how kame are used to soften the new spirits and actually make them more palatable and ready to drink. Much like oak, clay earthenware like this is semi-porous, allows oxygen to enter and interact with the liquid. But unlike oak, it doesn't provide much in terms of colour and flavour, perhaps a slight minerality in terms of flavour, but really the impact in terms of additional flavour is much, much less than oak. But as I said, it's semi-porous, so it allows this oxygen in and out of, and that slow oxidation and interaction between the various compounds inside can actually start to neutralise some of the harsh notes and textures and soften the spirit. Even with the polishing of the rice in this case, we're still going to get through some sulfur into these spirits, no doubt, as the polishing level is relatively low. So clay can actually act as a bit of a catalyzer for sulfur compounds as well, similarly to copper when we think of whiskey production. So that can actually kind of remove some of that influence of sulfur and actually soften and neutralize some of those more astringent textures and flavors. Compounds like aldehydes can start to esterify, and the complexity and concentration of the flavors tends to increase as they spend more time as they age for longer, but specifically with kame in this instance and this earthenware maturation. What I like to think of is those flavors being present throughout production, obviously inherent in the raw material or created by the koji or the yeast, but then really evolving via interaction with clay in this case, and developing into new things, building on and evolving these flavors, and then everything kind of concentrating and increasing in complexity as it spends time in the vessel and interacting with oxygen over time, as well as interacting with all the other compounds that are present. If spirit is aged for more than 3 years, it's known as Kyūshū, and Kyūshū means old liquor. And many of the spirits here and in other parts of the tour, in Okinawa, in Awamori, and other parts of Japan, they're aged for much longer than 3 years, certainly upwards of 30 years, regarded as noble aging, which can obviously again increase that complexity and that concentration of aroma even greatly. And those of you who are thinking this through, obviously there's going to be some angel share potentially to this as well. Obviously the ABV is lower than is typical in Western spirits production. So the ABV of the spirit that's going into these vessels is much lower, but there will be some evaporation certainly over time, which is going to mean concentration of what's left behind. The reason I focused on this at Ryūkyū is because they have their own kiln, and they produce all their own kame made from Okinawan black and red soil. And probably one of my biggest regrets is not buying a small little version kame as a souvenir. We all had the opportunity, but I'm not sure any of us took that option. I probably didn't have any room left in my case, to be honest, by the end of the trip, but I've always pined for one of these ones since I've got home. So let's move on, as we are more than halfway through, and I am not more than halfway through, so let me speed up. I will quick little interjection in terms of serving style. I'm sure many of you are intrigued about how our Aomori can be served, and this particular part of the trip was focused on Awamori and Awamori Suka. It was a very memorable dinner and food pairing opportunity that we had. I'm currently enjoying not an Aomori, but in my lovely cup that was given to me on the trip, in a uyuwari style with hot water. Mizuwari with cold water is very, very common as well. Here at the Aomori Suko, we paired various different shochus with different dishes. The particular image that you can see on the left there was the serve with our dessert, which was a winter melon dessert, which was tiny little sweet, but so full of flavour. And this Kyūshū Aomori went exquisitely with it. The image on the right, which I apologise for, is not the best image, but it's just taken on my phone, was actually an infusion of Aomori with tomato and other herbs, which was then used as the base for a spritz. So two very dramatically different ways of serving Aomori there, but it is probably, as far as I'm concerned anyway, the spirit that best goes with food. I always find food and spirit pairing slightly difficult and slightly crowbarred. Sorry to the brand ambassadors out there who do that. I've done that myself in the past. But I always think it's quite difficult given the high alcohol content. Obviously, the lower alcohol content in these spirits makes the matching with food slightly more like a wine and food matching. And really some of the complexities of flavour and savoury umami flavours that we find present in Awamori really pair well with food. I don't want to dwell too much on that because I've got lots of distilleries to cover, so let's move on. Okay, so on to Miyazaki Prefecture and Ochaishuzu. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Ochaishuzu. We're back onto the large island of Kyūshū. Not tropical in the same way that Okinawa was, but still humid and very warm summers. Fermentation here, though, now we're kind of back into Honkaku Shōchū, happens in two steps. Step one, where a small volume of koji, typically rice and water and yeast, are mashed for up to a week, allowing koji and yeast to develop in parallel. And once we have that kind of starter, if you like, then in step two, a secondary starchy material is added. And this secondary starchy material is the definitive starchy material. So what is added at that second stage is what defines the type and name of shochu produced. So if that second starch source is sweet potato, it's an imo shochu. If it's barley, it's mugi shochu. If it's kome, it's a rice shochu. And within those, there are local GIs that we'll come on to when we move into Kagoshima and Kumamoto. Here at Ochiai, they mostly make imo and mugi shochu, but they also make a ginger shochu, which is the one I showed some of you earlier, where small amounts of ginger are added in that second mash. It's fair to say that the whole quantity of that second mash is not simply ginger. That would be quite overwhelming, as we were told. But a small, I think around 15% of that second mash is ginger alongside sweet potato. And that ginger flavour really carries through into the final spirit. It's what I'm enjoying with hot water right now. It's probably because I've got a little bit of a cold. It's helping to clear my sinuses. So, the first and second mash fermentations at Ochiai and most distilleries takes place in clay vessels, which are set into the ground like the ones you see in the picture on the left-hand side. The fact that they are contained within the earth and the fact that they are set where they are helps naturally to control fluctuations in temperature. The temperature cannot get too high in these situations. The room will be temperature controlled as well, but obviously that maintenance of temperature is absolutely critical to ensure the high production and the high output of yeast in terms of alcohol, but also desirable flavors, and also the production of acid from the koji. Some of these fermenters are in excess of 100 years old. There's one in there which is the oldest, which many of us took photos of. And similarly to famed wooden fermenters in places like Jamaica, where these wooden fermenters have been around for such a long time and contain such a abundance of local microorganisms, these fermenters will hold a unique biome in themselves as well, and that local biome of various different microorganisms and bacterial activity will influence flavor compounds that are generated through the fermentation in these vessels. And the two-step fermentation here can last up to 3 weeks. So again, we've got a lot of opportunity for that yeast to create a great deal of flavor. Here it produces a wash of around 14%, which is significantly lower from the 17 and 18% typically that we certainly saw in Okinawa. The other area of production that I wanted to focus on here was something that again is prevalent within other parts of Honkaku Shōchū certainly, is enamel maturation as opposed to maturation in kame, in earthenware vessels. The picture that you can see there unfortunately is not of these enamel maturation vessels. These are old kame set outside the distillery, beautiful though it is. The enamel vessels are similar in the effect they have on the spirit, but the thing that I want to kind of highlight here is the fact that they are cooled to a degree that enables what we call the group 3 fractions, these fusel oils, these heavy fatty acids, to kind of coagulate enough so they can be skimmed and removed from the spirit. It's probably fair to say that these enamel vessels don't allow as much oxidation of the spirit. They don't allow enough oxygen in to kind of to contribute to the flavour in the same way. But as they are temperature controlled and cooled to such a degree, those group 3 fractions, which are much denser, much heavier, start to coagulate, start to foil kind of oily pools on the top of these enamel vessels, and they can be skimmed off and removed. If they weren't to be removed, the spirit would be much harsher, much grippier, much more difficult, and much more unpalatable in texture. Some of those group 3 fractions can really give a kind of astringency to a spirit, which frankly, in the case of certainly sweet potato shochus, they need to be removed, because otherwise they would be, overwhelming. And as with clay maturation there in enamel, we're starting to see some of those harsher notes soften. Compounds again will react together and then increase some of that concentration and complexity. The enamel vessels are mostly sealed on the top, but there still will be some evaporation of compounds, certainly the more volatiles within there, allowing some of that concentration and increased complexity through enamel aging. Right then, moving on to Osuzuyama and Kuroki Honton. These two are grouped together as we visited them in one session, if you like, and they are part of the same group, run by the same gentleman who you can see pictured there. And the real thing that I wanted to focus on here, firstly, is the difference in climate up here at Osuzuyama specifically. An increased altitude, really beautiful setting, a very new distillery which stuck in many of our minds, with a real kind of sustainable and environmentally friendly ethos, recycling waste products and grains as organic fertilizer for their crops. Fairly commonplace now with forward-thinking distilleries, but this is something that was really part of the ethos and the philosophy at Suzuyama and Kuroki Honton. Although they produce sweet potato and rice shochu here, Miyazaki is one of the main production centers for mugi shochu made from barley. So I really wanted to kind of focus on barley on this particular slide. Barley is grown locally or imported from Australia, and it's used here as well as rice, used to create white and black, but also yellow koji. And that's enabled through that really, really pristine temperature controlled koji room that you can see on the left-hand side. And, you know, it's probably the first distillery I think we encountered that is actually using yellow koji for shochu production. It's not the only one, but it's the first one we encountered. And I think that was really enabled by the fact they had this really pristine and carefully managed koji room. And as the sake experts amongst you know, that yellow koji, despite being harder to manage, can produce a really interesting, fruity, floral, fresh, zesty kind of aroma and taste. They've also got a selection of stills here using atmospheric distillation, as well as vacuum distillation. When using barley, and let's focus on barley specifically on this side, as we've said, we have this semi-solid wash, and when using atmospheric distillation, you're inevitably going to get some cooking of that wash and some Maillard reactions, resulting in actually these really delicious, I found this was really standout for me, delicious, rich, toasted, cereal, almost malty characteristics that you would have find akin to whiskey in some ways. When these washes are vacuum distilled, typically that barley will produce a slightly grassier and fruitier style of spirit, still single pot still distillation, still distilled to a very, very low strength when we compare it to European traditions. But certainly in vacuum distillation, much lighter and purer and more elegant, if you like, in style. But I really, got to say, really enjoyed some of that rich, roasted, toasty flavour and aroma that's come from atmospheric distillation at this distillery. The other thing I wanted to talk briefly about was wood maturation. We haven't talked about wood maturation yet during this presentation, and wood maturation is something that all of us on the trip, and I suppose most of you who are listening, are more familiar with. I think it's fair to say that there was a general consensus amongst the group that the oak-aged shochus that we tried during the trip were amongst our kind of least favourite, or they were the most contentious, shall we say, because some of those elegant flavours and textures that we enjoyed so much from Aomori and other regions, they can easily be overwhelmed by oak. Oak is used in various places, but obviously oak is very, very, very potentially overwhelming, and shochu can be very delicate in its aroma and flavour and its texture, you know, given the fact that it's watered down to such a degree. Some of that oak influence can start to overwhelm. Here though, I think, you know, it was used in a really, really positive way, really good effect. They had a combination of different barrels there. It's fair to note as well that they're making whiskey at this distillery, and this is the first distillery where we saw copper during the trip. We saw it later on in the trip as well, but we saw it here for their whiskey stills. But they're using new and ex-bourbon American oak here, as well as new and ex-cognac French oak, and importantly Japanese Mizunara oak as well, which some of you will be familiar from whiskey production. But really, really strikingly for me, a barley shochu, which not only used barley for the second mash, but also created the koji, aged in a variety of different woods. They had a Sakura aged version and a chestnut aged version, which I happen to have in front of me, which I will certainly pour come the end of the presentation, and that is really, really special and unlike anything else I'd tried before. Another thing to note here as well, there's precise limits to colour in terms of wood-aged shochu. So products aren't generally allowed to be beyond what we describe at WSET, at least, to be beyond a medium lemon colour, and this is to distinguish it from whiskey. Because take koji out of the equation, if you start to produce barley in this way, ferment it using yeast exclusively and distill it in pot stills and then put it into oak, it starts to just become a whiskey. So to differentiate barley mugi shochu from whiskey, there is and any shochu that is aged, differentiated from other aged spirits, there is a limit on the colour, and that colour can either come through little aging or actually filtration to remove some of that colour as well. Okay, let's move on because I am running out of time. I want to talk about Kumamoto. This is the only distillery we visited in Kumamoto, Toyonaga. This prefecture is very different, it's fair to say, in terms of terrain, in terms of climate. In between two volcanoes, there was a few volcanoes we saw during the trip, namely in Kagoshima, but Kumamoto has two volcanoes either side of this particular valley as well. And they have a GI for rice shochu made in this district. There used to be 200 distilleries here, but now, since World War I, there are only 28. And this is as far north as we visited, as I said, mountainous, cooler, but still wet. And those volcanoes provide a great deal of ash, obviously, which is good soil for rice and good conditions for rice growing. Kuma rice is a short grain variety, which provides this particular style of Honkaku Shōchū with kind of these grassy and actually quite creamy, yogurty aromas. There's a local Kuma yeast, which is attributed to creating a lot of tropical banana and vanilla aromas, namely outputs from the yeast like isoamyl acetate and precursors to vanillin, as we discussed in Awamori. And it's fair to say, I think everybody will testify to this. We've got an image of the second Moromi, the second ferment there on the right-hand side of the screen. When we walked into that room and when we took a whiff of fermentation, it was huge banana yogurt. That was the big descriptor for me and for many others. They're using white and black koji here, made from rice or barley. The white, as we've said, kind of retains more flavour of the raw material, but the black koji is going to layer on some of those roasted, smoky, nutty, even mushroomy flavours, which actually twin really, really nicely, I found, with some of that kind of creaminess and buttery yogurtiness of raw material. And just to make a note of the difference in koji rooms, we didn't get to see inside this one, but this is a much more traditional type koji room compared to the obviously more modern, pristine version that we saw previously at Suzuyama. Here they also had a selection of stills. And what I thought would be interesting to take note of, particularly here, was the comparison in terms of temperature. The distiller there gave us lots of insight into how he ran his stills, and atmospheric distillation was, as you can see, ran to a much higher temperature and much kind of shorter and hotter distillation of around 85 to 90 degrees Celsius, meaning that actually we've got all of those compounds and elements coming through distillation and through into the condenser in a quite condensed period of time. Through vacuum distillation, you can see that temperature that it runs at is much cooler, and the temperature is a wider gradient running at much, much slower rate, enabling those alcohols and those higher volatiles to come over first. As he said, much more of the kind of things that he attributes the flavour and aroma to coming over later in the distillation run. Now we get to Kagoshima, which was a huge part of our trip and something that I really want to focus on, the GI that they have there for Satsuma Shochu, made exclusively from sweet potato, which is steamed. It's fair to say here that we encountered some examples, not necessarily in Satsuma, if my memory serves me right, but we did see examples of sweet potato that is both aged but also baked, and those variables are also going to kind of influence flavour as well as the particular type of raw material that I'm going to come on to. But typically those sweet potatoes are cut into chunks and steamed, which is going to gelatinize those starches, as we saw at the start. Potato or rice Koji is used here, typically rice, but they're also making koji out of one of these varieties of sweet potato. And they're culturing white, black, and yellow koji. And I really wanted to have a bit of a focus on the amazing sweet potato. I enjoyed sweet potato before going on this trip, but I had no idea about the variety of sweet potatoes that were grown and enjoyed, certainly in Japan and around the world. There are so many varieties of sweet potato, and they have a huge influence on the characteristics of Satsuma Shochu produced. Obviously, they're providing the starch source, and they have varying degrees of starch within them, but they also have the propensity to produce lots of different, what we call aromatic compounds. Red varieties like Beni Asumi that you see there, rich in sucrose, used for sweets, lots of Japanese sweets made from this particular variety. Purple varieties like Aya Murasaki, which are lower in starch and therefore provide much less yield in terms of ethanol through fermentation, but are big in what we call polyphenols, big fruity floral aromas that you might associate with the muscat grape. White varieties like the most common Kogane Sengan, rich in linol, geraniol, which are both floral compounds, terpenes, which we will talk about more on the next slide, as well as kind of orange varieties that again are big, fruity, floral. And the type of sweet potato, I can't emphasize enough, has a huge influence on the style of spirit that's created. I'd say this part of the trip and this kind of insight was astounding to me, to kind of really focus in on the differences in raw material when accentuated or amplified or aided by the influence of different types of koji and yeast as well. Not only that, here this particular distillery at Nishi were creating, not only were they using a whole array of different raw materials, but and all three types of koji, they're also got a whole set of different stills at their disposal that you can see there on the left hand side. We have a multitude of stills with different shapes, as well as both atmospheric and vacuum distillations within the mix. Some with thin necks, some with much wider necks, which are going to kind of concentrate some of those aromas through into the line arm. But importantly, sometimes those necks contain rectification plates. You can see at some of those stills in the back, they've got a kind of ribbed exterior, which indicates they've got plates in the necks, which is going to increase reflux and going to increase the purity of the spirit, increase the distillation strength potentially. But also different line arms, which are again going to affect reflux dramatically. Some line arms which are going straight across, some which you can see are sharply turned down, and some which are slightly turned up, either promoting or nullifying reflux. Also here, we had an example of a traditional wooden still. Honkaku Shōchūs would have been made on wooden stills exclusively, and there are a few distilleries that we visited that retain those wooden stills. Unfortunately, it was a closely guarded secret, so I'm not allowed to show the photo for you all. But know that the spirits produced on these wooden stills would be very, very big and bold and potentially sulfury in their characteristics. Let's move on. This is a very geeky slide that I wanted to cover. I'll probably not cover it in too much detail because it's already 7 o'clock and I might be losing some people to their dinner already. But this is a chemical analysis of a Satsuma Shochu, or Imo Shochu, made obviously from sweet potato. And we can see from kind of the concentration of particular compounds at various stages in the distillation run. Between 0 and 8 minutes, we've got those higher alcohols that we'd expect, methanol and propanol, etc. But interestingly, at 10 to 15, we've got those kind of ethyl and iso groups, namely ethyl acetate, which we'd associate with this kind of aspartame and varnish aroma. Isoamyl acetate, which is one which is probably familiar to many of the rum fans out there, big banana and pear flavors associated with that compound, and ethyl lactate, which gives us a kind of buttery creaminess typically. But it's then from 18 minutes, you can probably see the arrival, and it's actually highlighted, albeit in Japanese there, the arrival of lots of what we call terpenes. Some of those things that I mentioned before when talking about the sweet potato varieties, linalool, which is typically very floral, terpineol, which is like kind of lilac perfume aroma, as well as citronellol, rose and citrus aromas. And lots of these sweet potato varieties are high in these compounds and can really, really carry through and dictate the style of spirit. One which really comes to mind is Diame, which I've spoke to a few of you about before, which is absolutely huge on those types of aroma, containing a lot of these terpenes, giving this big, bold, fruity, floral, almost muscat type, lychee, tropical fruit aromas that you might associate with certain wines and other things. The other thing about particularly the purple variety, and we've moved on to another distillery now at Komasu Gyozo, still in Kagoshima, focusing on Satsuma Shōchū, although they are making Shōchū out of rice and barley as well. That purple sweet potato that is so big in those aromas actually kind of has a lower starch content, so produces a much lower yield in terms of ethanol, but it's still used extensively at this distillery and Nishi, the previous one, because it's so famed for this flavour, which is starting to become even more popular as a in mixed drinks and other such things. There's also a higher potential for sulfur though, and the other thing I really wanted to show you at this distillery was the picture on the right hand side, which isn't a spaceship from a B movie. I think it looks a little bit like something like that. It's actually a still, but a still unlike anything we've ever seen before. It's horizontal for a start, so not tall like a typical still that you've seen in previous slides, or you would have seen in European traditions. This is long and wide and kind of tubular, with direct steam injection via a pipe that goes from end to end, which bubbles through what is a very, very low mash level, with a huge surface area. As you can probably imagine, this I don't know what the volume of this still is, but it is huge. And then 4 extraction points at the top of the still, 4 necks and 4 line arms, which is encouraging a huge rate of extraction, huge vapor collection, and minimal reflux, which is going to result in a much bigger, bolder spirit in nature, far less rectification, separation of those individual compounds within this distillation. We're taking it all through to the condenser. Not only that, this particular still, as I understand it, was used exclusively with black koji, and that's to kind of capture and retain all of that big flavor and big body that we associate with black koji, that kind of roasted, toasted, smoky, mushroomy, nutty aroma. So it's fair to say that the spirit produced on this type of still, and this is the only still of its type, as I understand it, in Japan, is big and bold and requiring of resting because of the amount of kind of potentially group 3 fractions, and but also for these kind of these sulfury compounds that need a little bit of kind of softening through age. I need to finish off with Umami, and I'm running over time, so apologies if I am delaying anybody's dinner, but I would be remiss not to talk about the amazing island of Umami, the producers of Honkaku Shōchū, which is not a GI, but it's only produced within Umami. Sugarcane was introduced to the island in the 16th century. That and rice are 2 main crops there. Moving into the 20th century, in World War II, rice was too valuable to be used for spirits production, so sugarcane was used instead, and it was used simply using yeast as we know it, not koji, just to produce rum, and there are still Japanese rum produced here and available. It was in 1953 though when Umami Mail Island returned to Japanese ownership. Previously, and similarly to Okinawa, it was a US military territory. And it was then in 1953 and onward when Honkaku Shōchū was defined as a sugarcane plus rice koji spirit, and definitively different, therefore, from rum. The sugarcane, as we saw, we were there in January. Sugarcane is harvested on the island between January and March, and they produce 250,000 tons per year. And we visited a small sugar producer, twinned with a cafe on the beach, a beautiful, beautiful part of the world, where they were producing this unrefined brown sugar. The stalks were squeezed to produce their juice, as I'm sure many of you have seen before within rum production. But then this juice is boiled down into basically a syrup, boiled at around 130 degrees Celsius to remove simply much of the water, but retaining a lot of the molasses, essentially, the kind of rich flavors that we associate with molasses, and some of those compounds that actually kind of drive that color and flavor. Much of the water is removed, but then what's left, that syrup, is set aside to cool, as you can see in the picture on the right hand side. And what we have left once it's dried is this kind of, say, really rich, dense, molasses heavy, what they call brown sugar, but I think actually more realistically would be called black sugar, because the molasses is still there. Lots of brown sugar that we know of actually has that brown color and that flavor added back in. It's simply white sugar with color added back to it. This is raw, unrefined brown sugar in that sense. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because it's being used to make a very, very particular type of shochu, as I say, which is known as Honkaku Shōchū and made exclusively on the islands of Umami. We all enjoyed the I noticed Natsuki saying yummy, sugar very much. We all sat or stood probably by that particular refinery for far too long, just munching on brown sugar. And yeah, it's absolutely delicious. I've brought some home with me, which did not last long. We visited 2 distilleries on the island of Umami, Machida Shuzo and Tomita Shuzo, both making Honkaku Shōchū using this raw brown sugar, but doing so in different ways. It's fair to say that we're very different distilleries and very different operations, both in terms of scale and style. Both start with Honkaku sugar, but there are different types, different sources of Honkaku sugar that we should mention at this point. Honkaku sugar that's from Umami Island specifically, which is typically softer and sweeter, more of those kind of caramels and maybe kind of soft chocolate flavors in there. But then also sugar from Okinawa, which is actually slightly more bitter. I found it tasted quite a lot like licorice personally, and this kind of herbal sweetness to it, maybe a more kind of bitter dark chocolate, and even a slight saline quality to it, some people said. This is paired with rice koji exclusively, and white and black varieties are used for the reasons that I mentioned before. Yellow varieties simply would not survive in these kind of climates. We need the high acid created via white and black varieties. And this happens in a 3-step mash. The reason it's not a 1 or a 2-step mash here is because actually we are adding essentially pure sugar, as opposed to a starchy substrate that needs to be converted. That yeast is interacting immediately with high volumes of sugar. If we were to dump it all in 1 step or in even 2 steps, there's the potential for that yeast to become overwhelmed with sugar and the environment not to be ideal for it to actually create alcohol. So it's done in a 3-step process. Once a wash has been created, remember the wash tasting very much like a lot of really kind of malty beers. Actually, personally, it had a real brown ale kind of quality to it to me. There's two different distillation types happening here, as there is with many other distilleries. But it's fair to say there was a focus on vacuum distillation and Machida and atmospheric distillation at Tomita. Both distilleries had both types of still, but a lot of the spirit produced at Machida was significantly lighter, significantly purer, significantly kind of cleaner and more elegant in style, whereas Tomita was a little bit more traditional, a little bit more robust and bold in flavour. Equally, they are involving plenty of earthenware maturation here to kind of soften some of those textures, influence some oxygen, and really kind of contribute to some of that kind of complexity and concentration of flavour too. I'm trying to hurry through. I think I am pretty much at the end. Yes, the final slide I really wanted to do was just to embarrass a few of us on the trip. That is everybody who was on the trip. It was incredible. Thank you to everybody. We all look equally silly there, so I hope none of you hold me to account. Finally, if you want to know a little bit more about this particular spirit category, as well as the other Asian spirits, Baijiu and Soju of Korea and China, then the level 3 award in spirits is obviously the thing to do. I know some of you on the call have already done it, and some of you very recently. I look forward to hearing your glowing reports. This is the most advanced multi-category spirits qualification there is in the world. You won't be surprised to hear that selling this is what I do on a daily basis. But yeah, if you want to know more about this or any of our other qualifications, obviously check out our various channels and streams there. All right, I think that is that.